Today, we are here remotely at Kinokuniya Bookstore with author Mike J. Mike J has written extensively on scientific and medical history and contributes regularly to the London Review of Books and the Wall Street Journal. His previous history on the drugs include mescaline, high society, and the atmosphere of heaven. We're interviewing him today for his most recently published book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, published by Yale University Press. Mike J, welcome.
Oh, good to be here, Ariel.
Yeah, it's the same. I just want to say, I'm so glad you wrote another book on drugs. Like the last one you wrote, mescaline, this book is well researched and beautifully written, and reading Psychonauts, I got the sense that the book is a kind of deeper dive and expansion of the themes of your previous work. Could you please give us a brief overview of themes you explored in this book?
Sure. I've written quite a lot previously, as you say, about the history of drugs, which is has been, I mean, there's a lot of really great scholars coming into it now, but it has been a kind of relatively unexplored territory. And one of the things that I've been interested in for a very long time is this story of self-experimentation, that, once you go back before the 20th century, then scientists and doctors and philosophers and psychologists and people who are studying the effects of drugs on the mind do so in what is by many, in many respects, the obvious way. They take the drugs themselves and see what happens and experience the effects for themselves. And that's, of course, so different to the way that institutional science operates these days, that I think it's a fascinating lens to go back to that period and to see what happened when people who were writing about drugs and discovering the effects of drugs and exploring the mind did so through their own experience, and often with just really beautiful descriptions of their subjective experiences, because which kind of spans in a very interesting way across science and art and literature, because writing a description of your state of consciousness or what happens to you when you take a strange drug, that's, on the one hand, that's a kind of scientific endeavor, but on another hand, it's a literary exercise. And back in those days, I think a lot of scientists were very well read in literature. A lot of them were also, poets and wrote, and they took a great pride. I mean, these days we have our tick box diagnoses, but before you had that, there was a great skill as a doctor in describing exactly what your patient was experiencing or what you were experiencing. So there's just a fantastic literature back there, and I think literary figures also, we're more familiar perhaps with their drug writings, but if you look at where that came from, there's usually a scientist at the back of that, and a lot of literary figures were very well versed in the science and medicine of the time. So I guess that's what I'm trying to use to do in this book, was to use self-experimentation as a way of opening up this whole forgotten world of drug literature.
Yeah. A case in point in your book, with a sort of scientifically minded exploration of altered states, is and this sort of relationship with the arts and literary description is Humphrey Davy. So Humphrey Davy's, he discovered nitrous oxide, very prominent, scientist, and yet his descriptions of the nitrous oxide induced altered state are beautiful, right? Just as literary texts, and of course he was friends and familiar with a bunch of poets. One of them, most prominently, I think Coleridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was friends with Coleridge. So yeah, I think more people need to hear about this. That scientists can respectably study these drugs from a subjective standpoint. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great. So both, the cover for the book, and you got like I'll just show the audience, you got like a psychedelicized young William James on here, and the title is also pretty interesting, Psychonauts. Most of our audience won't be familiar with the term psychonaut. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But just in case, could you please give us a definition of the word?
Sure, yeah, because I'm also slightly reclaiming it here in a way. The term psychonaut was coined in the 1940s by a German author called Ernst Junger in a novel that he wrote that was set in the future, where there was this kind of futuristic cadre of scientists who took strange new drugs and explored kind of the inmost recesses of the mind. And Ernst Junger was the great hero and mentor to Albert Hofmann, the guy who discovered first synthesized LSD. So through Hofmann, the word psychonaut appeared. So you'll hear it these days quite often in psychedelic culture, and it normally has a particular meaning that it means someone who's a bit of a rebel or a bit of a renegade working outside institutional science. So I kind of wanted to reclaim that and take it back to the period that I'm mostly writing about, the period just before the 20th century, when sure, there are plenty of rebels and renegades in my story, but there are also kind of famous scientists and doctors and pillars of the establishment. And it was a period when not everybody, but an awful lot of people working in this space were psychonauts.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how prior to this kind of crystallization of the term drug and sort of all the sort of negative connotations that we associate with it, these sort of mind-altering substances had a kind of neutral, well, not so neutral, but a kind of different set of connotations or swirling around them. So it's interesting that you were able to show that in the book. This third question probably segues beautifully to what you just said. So in the mid 20th century, we got the beat poets, with their cannabis and Zen Buddhism, and about a century earlier, we had the Romantic poets with their opium and German idealism. Can you tell us a little bit about this earlier counterculture and its relationship with drugs?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point out that the word drugs, as we're using it now, doesn't really exist until the 20th century. I mean, this kind of stunned me when I first discovered it, because like most people, I grew up assuming that drugs just kind of appeared in the 1960s and they'd always been illegal. But this kind of stigmatized term drugs doesn't really appear until the 20th century. So if you go back before then, this is a very kind of disparate array of different substances, and some of them you'd find as herbal remedies, and others, would be research chemicals that scientists would use, and others would be, stuff that doctors would use, like anesthetics, for example. But an awful lot of them you would just find in the pharmacy, things like cocaine and heroin and cannabis you could kind of buy in any regular pharmacy in those days. So I think in that sense, there wasn't, when you look at when the word drug first appears, it's got all these, as you say, all these kind of negative connotations baked into it. It means kind of dangerous and addictive and, foreign and illegal or criminal. Back in a world before that existed, there isn't really quite such a subculture around drugs. I think the subculture really emerged once they disappeared from the pharmacy shelves, and people who used them had to seek out other people who used them. But in the 19th century, we'll keep using the word drugs because it's easy, but
Right.
there were many different stereotypes. It wasn't, if you said somebody who, abused addictive drugs, then people might likely imagine some, sort of poor, sad, lonely widow leaning a bit too much on her morphine, that would have been just as much that as it might be a decadent poet or whatever. Right. So back in the 19th century, sorry?
Right. Or a doctor. right?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
doctor.
Yeah, no, and doctors were really the people who seeded all this, as well as kind of developing this kind of, anti-drug discourse. One of the reasons that they did so was because so many of the people who were getting into trouble with drugs at that point were doctors or doctors' wives or dentists or whatever. So yeah, but you find a few of these fantastic literary scenes. You mentioned Humphrey Davy, who was a very young chemist who synthesized nitrous oxide, and he was astonished to discover that if you inhaled a lungful of it, you had this great sort of rush of pleasure and euphoria, and also this amazing sort of cosmic sense that you'd seen, the absolute, he describes kind of being, a disembodied, consciousness just floating around in this universe that's completely composed of thoughts and ideas. So, of course, as a scientist, he wanted to try that on other people and other volunteers. And he was particularly interested in his friends who were writers and poets. So he asked everybody who took it to write a little description of the experience. And he said, what we need is a language of feeling, because these are sensations. This is a state of consciousness no one's ever experienced before. There are no words for it. How do we do that? And I think that's why he worked so closely with Coleridge and Robert Southey and the other romantic poets, because they were trying to do the same thing. They were also looking for a language of feeling, a way of describing sensations and moods and emotions that nobody had really described before. So from that point on, the study of drugs was, of course, about chemistry and pharmacy, but it was also about poetry and philosophy, and it fed into the Romantic movement. We think of figures like Thomas de Quincey, who was Coleridge's sort of protege and pupil, who wrote about, framed his whole biography around, his descriptions of opium. And then in Paris in the mid-century, again, as usual, there's a doctor or a scientist at the back of this. Jacques-Joseph Moreau, who's what we would now call a psychiatrist, who starts experimenting with eating huge doses of hashish and having hallucinating for hours and lying around unable to move and speak. And his instinct as well is to summon the creative people he knows, the writers and the musicians, and he forms this famous salon in Paris called the Club des Hachishins, the Hashish Club. And a lot of those figures of mid-19th century French literature, passed through there. Balzac and Baudelaire and Dumas and Flaubert, and the French literary public, by the 1850s is pretty familiar with hashish and what it does. Big blockbusters like Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo have a scene in the middle where there's somebody, a mysterious figure in Oriental dress, handing out little bits of green jam, as they're called, sort of hashish, sort of Turkish delight, and going to this place where reality and dreams mix and you can't pull them apart. So yeah, you can see, in the 19th century, even though it's a time when our idea of drugs hasn't really formed, you still get kind of, the beginnings, the recognizable prototypes for what we today regard as kind of literary drug scenes.
Yeah. And also you said earlier that prior to this kind of crystallization of the notion of drugs, that was free of negative connotations and maybe even a sense of like it's associated with some foreign other. But there is a strong sense in the sort of a lot of the 19th century discourse, but particularly literary discourse for around hashish taking, that has a kind of almost a 1001 Arabian Nights flavor to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's so there was some sort of like it had a kind of exotic flavor to it, but it wasn't necessarily negative. It was almost a kind of positive Orientalism, if such a thing exists, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's also, I mean, and it sits on top of the fact that, as I say, these drugs are widely available. You can buy them anywhere. So, that it's not a mystery to people, things like opium and hashish, these are just things you can buy over the counter. So laying an Oriental gloss over them is, inside, like with Thomas de Quincey, for example, I think he says Confessions of an Opium Eater is his title. I think people at the time would have found that very funny. It was kind of a joke. It was a bit like saying Confessions of a Paracetamol Eater or something. Everybody thought of opium as this very mundane substance, that you took, when you had a headache or period pain. So it's basically just the go-to analgesic. And so De Quincey was kind of queering it in a sense. He was saying, no, you all think this is a really normal substance, but let me tell you, if you kind of take enough of it and take it properly, there's heaven and hell back there.
Yeah, yeah. I guess it was both good PR, giving it this kind of exotic sheen, but also sort of preparing those who were intrepid enough to take those kinds of high doses for something that's genuinely other and strange. I mean, some of these accounts of like high dose hashish are just they match anything you can find in Arrowwood. It's like
Yeah,
it's just
absolutely.
they're insane. I love it.
No, and at that level, we have to think of hashish as kind of a psychedelic, really. This is something that just gives you a very long, intense trip, and that's something that, people who are buying it in the chemist for muscle spasm or whatever are not looking for. I mean, I guess we have our equivalents today. There are cough syrups that you get over the counter that if you look on Arrowwood, you'll find that if you drink half a bottle and combine it with something else, so yeah, it's I think we can recognize that in our own culture today.
Yeah, they're definitely parallels. So it's probably my favorite chapter. It was pretty cool. The sixth chapter of the book, you cover the life of a fascinating African American figure I never heard of before until reading your book, Pascal Beverly Randolph.
Yeah,
Did I pronounce the first name right?
I believe
Pascal.
so.
Yeah, Pascal. As I was, as I was reading the chapter, I was like thinking, like, man, this guy's like really cool. He's like a Black Aleister Crowley or something like that. And I'm like, why isn't nobody writing about this guy? So I'm glad you did. He's really cool. Can you tell us a little bit about Pascal Randolph Beverly? Yeah.
Yeah, Pascal Beverly Randolph. Yeah, he's a fascinating character. I think I'd kind of come across him a bit. That is a really huge, solid, door-stopping biography of him, which is great. But what's interesting, I think, is the way he weaves in and out of this kind of early hashish culture and early interest in spiritualism and magic. So he's he's black or mixed race. We don't
Mhm.
quite know. In his own account, he says, "Oh, my mother was Madagascan royalty or whatever." But back in those antebellum days, a lot of people had a story for themselves which didn't involve, Afro-American slave routes. So he may have had those as well. He grew up in Five Points, which was right in the slums of New York at that time, and with an absent father, and he became a very, very talented young spiritualist. He would do amazing trance channeling performances where he would channel famous figures from history, and this particularly after the spiritualist craze really got going in the sort of 1840s and 1850s. He became a star in that world and went to Paris, and in Paris he met a very different world, a world full of hypnotists and mesmerists and spiritualists who had been reading all this French hashish literature and had started experimenting with hashish themselves and using it in magical rituals and ceremonies to try and achieve the sort of immersion in this state of consciousness where they could work their way through the keys and portals into the spirit world or the astral plane or whatever. And Randolph was obviously very talented at this, and then he went on from there to the Orient, as it was, Egypt or Turkey, and he came back from that to America, as somebody who'd learned all this ancient, sort of mysteries of Oriental magic, and also brought back large amounts of hashish with him. I think he was probably the biggest hashish importer into the United States in the 1860s, and he sold mail order all these different pills and potions and tinctures which used hashish a lot, and he kind of different ones were recommended for clairvoyance and for spiritual healing and so on. So he's a really fascinating character, and yeah, as we were saying, he entered into this world where hashish was on the one hand a kind of pharmacy preparation, and on the other hand you had all these kind of flowery Oriental Arabian Nights style descriptions of it by Fitzhugh Ludlow and these sort of you know, white poets, and he kind of fused those two languages together brilliantly, and it became his kind of key magical device.
Yeah. It's also I guess it was like really good PR for the products that he was selling. I mean, I think he was selling some of them for like $4 you know, or an ounce or something like that, which I can imagine that's like super expensive at the time, like $4.
It's super expensive, and he's saying this is not the same as the hashish preparations you get in the chemist. They'll just like stupefy you and sedate you. You know, this is the real deal. You know, and you know, I've been taught how to prepare this by the you know, the physicians of the court of the Sultan and whatever and so on.
Yeah.
From his PR was second to none.
Yeah. From 5 points to Blavatsky, I think he did well. He did well for himself. So let's see. In the book, you know, you claim that our current notion of drugs, with all the connotations associated with the word, is quite recent, right? And that you show that there's a long history of changes in public perceptions on the use of psychotropic substances. Can you give us a kind of brief overview of this history, maybe from like the early 19th century, maybe starting with I don't know, with De Quincey, and leading up to the mid 20th century, say?
Yeah, what's the I mean, I guess, you know, a lot of these what we now call drugs are present, but you know, as we say, the word drugs isn't there, so people encounter them in different contexts. Things like particularly once you've got surgery and dentistry, quite a lot of people have experiences with nitrous oxide and ether and chloroform, which are kind of incidental to the surgery, but also kind of mind-blowing. And so there's quite a literature around people describing, you know, having surgery and inhaling some chloroform or some ether, and the next thing they know, they've left their body and they're up on the ceiling looking down at their body and having these kind of strange spiritual experiences. So there's all that kind of discourse. At the same time, there's, you know, these are really the staples of, you know, pharmacy. So, you know, if you've got any kind of aches or pains and you're looking for sort of any analgesic or anything to help you sleep or pep you up, you know, then there are these preparations which, you know, not always labeled, but, you know, often contain morphine and cannabis and cocaine. You know, the pharmaceutical industry really takes off then in the late 19th century. Cocaine is a real sort of boom time for that. That's this new pharmaceutical that does so many things, because it clears your nasal passages and your sinuses, so it's supposed to be good for your voice. It's also kind of a pick you up and like an energy drink, like the kind of things we have today, and also an antidepressant, you know, something against the blues that helps you cope with the strains and stresses of modern life. So I think by the end of the 19th century, you're starting to get the sense that there's this juggernaut of industrial drug production, which is making stronger and stronger drugs and kind of pumping them out there, and people start to get concerned about them, and you know, not knowing exactly what's in there, you know, their cough mixture or their sort of nighttime cough syrup. So by the end of the 19th century, you start to get these people start to group these substances together and talk about addictive drugs or dangerous drugs, or, you know, drugs that you should only take if a doctor prescribes them and so on. So yeah, by the end of the 19th century, the combination of sort of mass industrial production and doctors prescribing them massively, and new technologies like the hypodermic needle being available, then by that time you can start to see that drugs are becoming a real source of concern and anxiety. And this is the beginning of the temperance movement that's leading up to prohibition. And you know, people are worried that, you know, looking at the 20th century and saying, how can we have, you know, a modern civilized society with all these substances legally available? And of course, top of the list of the drugs that people are concerned about at this point is alcohol, you know, because that's the most prevalent. And, you know, that's actually one of the things people are most worried about with patent medicines, is like the amount of alcohol in them. So a lot of the, you know, public debate gets focused around alcohol, and then these other drugs kind of the discourse around them sort of tends to bring in different ethnic minorities, because that's where they're perceived, you know, to have their real user base. So cocaine becomes associated with the black population of the southern states, cannabis with the Mexican population, you know, and it gets called marijuana to make it sound more foreign and scary, and of course opium with the Chinese population.
Right. And I think it's really interesting where you bring in how the 19th century is sort of contrary to sort of a kind of conventional view of the 19th century, is that it had a more kind of, at least in this point, on the discourse around drugs, had a more individualistic take on them, where it's like, well, you know, you do this, you know, for exploration or for, you know, for science or whatever, you know, but in the 20th century, right, you know, especially when these big government institutions start to sort of notice drugs and regulate them, the discourse shifts to well, a drug user is, you know, citizens are part of a society, and if you're taking drugs, then you're sort of abstaining from your duties, you know, as a citizen. So therefore, drugs are bad, you know. So it's that's an interesting shift in the discourse, you know.
Yeah, I think it's counterintuitive, because we think of, you know, the progressive era, you know, the early 20th century, and we think of, you know, the mass movements and the sort of, you know, popular involvement in sort of citizenship and all these kind of grassroots movements from below. But of course, you know, the big progressive era policy that we remember is alcohol prohibition, you know, so and that was pushed by a lot of progressive interest groups, by the women's movement, by doctors and so on, but also by the more conservative, you know, reactionary sort of forces in society, you know, the church and the old establishment. So I think one of the things that happens in the progressive era is that just as we suddenly have the word drugs, you also start to get the idea of the drug user. As you say, these are individualists, hyper individualists, you know, who are not good citizens, but also they become a group, because this is also the time when social science starts to grow. There are more statistics around. You look at, you know, the actuarial data from insurance companies, for example, and you can see, okay, if you put them together as a group, then people who drink heavily or use other drugs, you know, these are people who are more likely to have chronic illnesses, their life expectancy is lower. So even though they're individuals, they become at this point for the first time, you know, a group, a sort of social category that you can make generalizations about and set policy towards.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a, you know, I think you kind of bookend the book and illustrating this shift in the perception of drugs with the figure of James Lee, or is it Lee James?
James Lee, yeah.
James Lee, yeah, where, you know, James Lee sort of kind of spans like the mid 19th century and then sort of a little bit of the beginning of the 20th. And it's almost like he's able to see, like at the beginning, it's almost sort of like I forget what was William Burroughs basically you know, refers to him or his time as kind of innocent or wholesome, you know, his sort of wholesome regimen for taking drugs. And then, you know, by the beginning of the 20th century, you know, he gets caught up in, you know, somewhere in Europe, and an overdose happens or something like that, and it's, you know, all those new connotations surrounding drugs, right? Sort of solidify to just sort of pre-write the story, the narrative, I'm
Yeah.
referring to his wife, or his wife had
Hmm.
died, and the fact that she was an Indian woman, and but
That's right. I mean, his James Lee's story is fantastic. I think we know it from his memoir called Underworld of the East, which he wrote after he'd retired,
mm,
which was about, he was a working class guy from the northeast of England, and who was an engineer, and found life in England kind of boring and conformist. So he went off and got jobs in the British colonies, mostly in India and Southeast Asia, where he discovered all manner of drugs. And yeah, William Burroughs loved his book, and I think he's one of the links between the sort of literature of that period and now. But he's very valuable in the context of the story that we've just been talking about, that sort of progressive era narrative where a lot of the discussion of drugs is about the dangers and the risks of working class white people being polluted or infected by the degenerate habits of inferior races. That's how the conversation goes. But of course, there's never any actual testimony from working class people in that,
yeah,
and that's what James Lee gives us. And just his wonderful sense of discovery, of a world where he gets. He's not a typical colonialist. He gets as far away from the British expats as possible, marries an Indian woman, as you said, and spends lots of time, as much as he can, in sort of Asian underworld haunts, tries all these different drugs and combines things that he finds, like hashish, with things like cocaine that he gets from doctors and injects, and so he builds up this incredible repertoire of drugs. And then comes back to Britain just at the beginning of the First World War, when everything is kind of clamping down and closing down, and all these things are bought under the counter, and suddenly if you take drugs, then you're a delinquent, you're a criminal. And he's like, and that's the point at which he gives up. He says, I never signed up for this. I was I'm not interested in being part of some criminal scene. So I think really he's a great illustration of that particular type of freedom that flourished in the 19th century and then was closed down in the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th.
yeah, it's pretty interesting. um uh So, there seems to be a return at the moment to regarding psychotropic drugs and their relevance to philosophical thinking, right? In the past we had Humphrey Davy and his commitment to idealism, everything is thoughts, and William James, acknowledging the validity of Hegel through his use of nitrous oxide. And we're getting something like this now, where there are academics who are starting to see the value of psychotropic drugs, not just for medicinal reasons, which that's obviously a valuable part of the discourse, but also for philosophical exploration, right? We had last year the first academic conference on the philosophy of psychedelics, spearheaded by a guy named Peter Shustet. And
Yeah.
oh yeah, you're familiar with him. And what are your thoughts on this sort of possible synergy between philosophy and drugs?
Yeah, I mean, we had Chris Letherby's book on the philosophy of psychedelics, which is, kind of like what William James was saying. It's kind of the argument that we don't need to posit any kind of supernatural forces or hyperspace entities from another dimension. What's going on in the mind with psychedelics is natural once we recognize, as William James did, that our normal waking consciousness is only one type of consciousness, and there are many other types of consciousness in which the world looks really different. And you can't really just dismiss these by saying, well, they were drug induced, but because they're still experiences and they can be valuable and they can be meaningful, as William James's nitrous oxide experience was to him. The problem, for James, as well as for the Benjamin Paul Blood, who was his introduction to this, and further on is kind of, what can you bring back from this? And that was what people always said to William James at the time. Well, it's all very well, these wonderful adventures in consciousness, but what are you bringing back? What's the takeaway? What's the ultimate truth? And James said, well, these things, it's really hard to bring anything back, and you don't really need an ultimate truth to justify them. They're experience like any other experiences. Right. So I think subsequently to that, through the 20th century, there was some very profitable exchange between psychedelics and phenomenology, as a discipline. It was just about, paying attention, to the things and to the phenomena themselves. And phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, for example, I think got a lot of use out of psychedelics. And I think, philosophers of consciousness, have always found them interesting, and I think they'll continue to do so.
Yeah, I think Merleau-Ponty in the phenomenology of perception, he has like a whole section where he discusses mescaline, and it's just such a beautifully close description of the mescaline experience. But
yeah, and I think he has a pretty good takeaway, Merleau-Ponty. He says, yes, this is a really powerful experience, but at the same time, I know that I'm the only person having this experience. No one else is having it. And I kind of want to have an experience that everybody else, is validated by other people. And there is a difference between an experience that's entirely solipsistic and an experience that's part of our consensus reality. And he also says it's a physical experience. We can't entirely, we're not brains in a vat. When we have an experience like this, it's not simply happening in our brain. Brains occur in people, and people occur in societies. And I think he says at the end of this section, consciousness is embodied and social. And I think that's a great takeaway.
And it almost sounds like a very beautifully convoluted version of the notion of set and setting. It's like Merleau-Ponty was talking about set and setting years before Leary, so I put it out there. But yeah, I think this is I mean, we're at the early stages, but I think there's going to be a lot of fruitful exchange between close descriptions of, phenomenological descriptions of altered states, particularly induced by drugs, and philosophy, right? We also have like talking, speaking of like making this more of a kind of shared experience. I think, are you familiar with Andrew Gallimore, his work?
Yes, I am.
Well, he just recently released the sort of early results for his DMT Extend. Yeah, and so far it sounds fascinating. I think if you can get like a bunch of people having similar experiences and then come back and then build a kind of language for it, I think
having a little more time to make sense of it, because I think one of the things about kind of attempts to describe the DMT experience, of which there are a lot, is it's so fast, it comes up and hits you so hard, takes you off into this kind of hyperspace, and then 5 minutes later you're back again, and there's been no time really to process or to experience. So I think for people who are interested in exploring that further, his idea that you can kind of, keep people on a DMT cannula or whatever and kind of, stay in that state long enough to get used to it. This is, we've had a lot of this over the 20th century as well, about out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, and lots of people have tried to study those. I think one of the things about drug experiences, and people like William James and the Society of Psychical Research in the 19th century noted, they're reproducible. They're in a way easier to study because you can do what science likes to do. You can sit in a laboratory and take a kind of precisely measured dose of a drug and then see what happens. I mean, it's much more easier for science to assimilate than sitting in a seance with a medium, for example.
Yeah, and I think DMT IV is probably more efficient than, like, say, what Humphrey Davy was doing, building a whole wooden box and, filling it up with like a bunch of, nitrous oxide. It's you might arrive at the sort of conclusion that everything is thought's a little bit easier with, with DMT on IV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, although I think Davy remains, the kind of, the reference point for that particular sort of branch of psychonautics, as we might call it.
Yeah, yeah. Could you read us a passage from your new book, Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind?
Is there one that you've got in mind?
No, I mean you can pick anyone. I mean, you just write so beautifully that I would just close my eyes and just point at any, and it'll just be a great passage.
One of the points I sort of make in the book is that what we call psychedelics now that arrived in the 1950s, they kind of inhabited a cultural niche that had previously existed. People had been having, as we discussed, these same experiences on drugs that we don't call psychedelic, whether chloroform or hashish or nitrous oxide or whatever. But there's a moment when the first of what we would call major psychedelics arrives right at the very end of the 19th century in the form of peyote. So what happens is that and as I described in my previous book, mescaline, first ethnographers and doctors start to encounter the peyote cactus among the plains tribes in the southwest and bring them back, and doctors start to experiment with them, particularly in America. Silas Weir Mitchell, who's America's great leading neurologist, and he writes up a beautiful report in the medical journal about his experience, and that's read by a very interesting British figure, Havelock Ellis, who is a doctor, but he's also an art critic and a sort of social progressive and an aesthete, and he's so interested by this description that in his rooms in London he eats dissolves a few peyote buttons, breaks them up in water and drinks them down, and has the first really full-on psychedelic experience. So I write a little bit about his description of that. Ellis began with a careful ethnography of the cactus's indigenous use in tribal Mexico, noting that the Tarahumara people treated it as a god and celebrated it with a fantastic and picturesque dance. He experienced it, however, as a procession of, quote, what might be called living arabesques, a saturnalia of the specific senses, and above all an orgy of vision in which he inhabited a world of dazzling colours, shapes and textures. So this is Ellis. The visions never resembled familiar objects. They were extremely definite, but yet always novel. They were constantly approaching, yet constantly eluding the semblance of known things. I would see thick, glorious fields of jewels, solitary or clustered, sometimes brilliant and sparkling, sometimes with a rich, dull glow. Then they would spring up into flower shapes beneath my gaze, and then seem to turn into gorgeous butterfly forms or endless folds of glistening, iridescent, fibrous wings of wonderful insects. Remembering that its indigenous adepts kept a fire brightly burning through their mescal rites, he turned on the gas lighting. As the shadows flared, pulsed, and took on a life of their own, Ellis was reminded of the paintings of Claude Monet, and as I gazed at the scene, it occurred to me that mescal perhaps produces exactly the same conditions of visual hyperesthesia, or rather exhaustion, as may be produced on the artist. He drew extensively on his vast store of artistic references, comparing the visions to exquisite porcelain objects, or the Maori style of architecture, or the delicate effects of lace carved in wood, which we associate with the Mukrabieh work of Cairo. Recollecting the experience in tranquility, he decided that, quote, if ever it should chance that the drinking of mescal becomes a habit, the favourite poet of the mescal drinker will certainly be Wordsworth, who described perfectly the halo of beauty which it casts around the simplest and commonest things.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah. I really look forward to seeing the time where we can have where these kinds of experiences start to flood into literature, contemporary literature. I think that'll be great, but thank you, Mike J. Again, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your new book.
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, same. And the book is Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind, published by Yale University Press. Everybody get this book. It's good for you. Read it.